Hello folks, Simon here, welcome back to the channel. Now, one of the more divisive issues about the Final Fantasy VII Remake, especially over recent days and weeks since people have been completing the game, is just exactly how much Square are meant to be sticking to the original story and how much liberty fans are willing to give them in terms of changing things up. Now, what's interesting is that thanks to the recent interview that's come out in the Final Fantasy VII Remake Ultimania, it seems that this contention isn't just limited to a discussion amongst the fans, but Square themselves were reckoning with this throughout development of the game. Just how much can they change the story and how much do they need to rigidly stick to the original. But it wasn't just the development team as a whole that were talking about these things. There was actually contentions between two specific groups of the development team, and that's what we're going to look at today, because I think that's going to speak volumes as to the different mindsets that perhaps different types of people in terms of where they're coming from for the remake are going to have about this question. Now, as always, I want to give a thank you to Audrey here on Twitter for providing us with these translations. So I will leave a link to Audrey's Twitter feed down in the video description, of course. And also, I would like to give a shout out to Ultimately IT, who has become the latest channel member. So thank you so much for your support there. And of course, to everybody who continues to support my channel. So let's go ahead and bring up the translation of the interview here with Hamaguchi, Toriyama, and Endo. This is, as I say, taking place in the Ultimania in Japanese, but here it's translated. Right, so the first interesting thing, though, is when this is answering the issue of, you know, actually approaching the remake and how they're going to do that in comparison to the original game here. First of all, they mention the graphics, or Hamaguchi mentions the graphics here, and says that they pretty much just stayed close to the original in terms of their graphic design, that they wanted the core elements of the design from Final Fantasy VII to be brought across into the remake, and I think we can pretty much generally agree that we got that. Obviously things were a little less pronounced, you know, as in Cloud's hair wasn't as mad as it was in the original, but the style of it was still pretty much the same. Okay, that's fine. Then Toriyama says something really interesting. This is moving away from the graphic side of things, more to the actual scenario, to the story, and the characters, I guess, themselves. And he says this, that for the staff who had a lot of attachments to Final Fantasy VII, so in other words, these were the staff, I guess, that were the fans of the original game that were now working on the remake, we had to make sure that we did not stray too much away from the source material. For those of us who made the original Final Fantasy VII, these restrictions did not exist, as it was a completely new story. And whatever we thought was interesting to put in, we just added to the story. So there, we can see that Toriyama is actually distinguishing between two different groups of people here in terms of the staff that were working on the remake. You have those that did not work on the original game but were fans of it, contributing to the development, and you had those that did work on the original game that came back to work on the remake. And these two groups had very different approaches and understandings as to, you know, what could be changed and what couldn't be. For those that were working on the game that were fans of the original, they wanted to stick as close to the original game as possible in terms of the story for the remake. But for the developers of the original game that came back to the remake, they were willing to be a lot more free in terms of expanding and changing the story from the original to what they were now creating. Now, that contrast is really, really interesting to me. I'm not going to give a commentary as to why I think it exists. I honestly don't know. And I'm sure there will be those that assume that, oh, well, that just means the developers of the original game obviously don't care as much about it as the fans do if they're willing to make more changes. I don't think that's a fair thing to say. I mean, these were the people that put in their blood, sweat and tears into bringing us the game that we loved so much back in the 90s. To say that they don't care about it, it just doesn't seem right to me. That doesn't fit. There's obviously something else at play here that means that the fans and the developers are approaching things from a slightly different angle, which is causing this contrast. Now, maybe that's a good thing for the remake overall, because it's creating a balancing effect where you don't go to one extreme or another. One extreme being perhaps where the game is an absolutely identical one-for-one copy of the original game, which might get stale very quickly when people realise that it is therefore inferior to the original game because it's not the original. And then the other extreme being, of course, where everything is so radically changed and different, it's almost unrecognisable as Final Fantasy VII. Although some fans, I understand, might say that the direction the remake has gone in would perhaps lean towards that extreme, but I think we do need to find out to see where Part 2 goes to determine that. And then next up, they talk about some of the gameplay elements that were included in the original Final Fantasy VII and how they balance bringing those across into the remake, whilst not, I guess, you know, bringing all their cards over for Part 1, but also making sure there was enough exciting stuff to keep people engaged throughout the, the whole of the game. And the example given by Hamaguchi here is with the fire spell. Now, in the original Final Fantasy VII, it was unlikely that you were going to leave Midgar with anything other than the first level of fire magic. Now, yes, you could do a little bit of serious grinding and maybe come out of that place with Fire R, or Fire 2 as it was known in that game, but it wasn't really likely. However, in the remake, you not only get Fire, you have the ability to get Fire Gar as well, the level 3 version of the spell. Now, Hamaguchi mentions the fact that they've let you get Fire Gar here in the remake, but they've saved Flare for Part 2. Although Flare isn't technically a fire spell, in the original Final Fantasy VII, it's a non-elemental spell. And in fact, I'm sure Flare does exist in the remake, maybe with the Chocobo summon or something like that. And it's also a non-elemental spell, so they're not really connected, those two. But I get the point. There are questions that some people are asking about his statement here as to how this ties into whether or not we'll be able to carry progress across from Part 1 into Part 2. I don't think that's Hamaguchi's point here, one way or another. I'm sure that's a question that developers are probably still grappling with. Hopefully, maybe they've solved that problem. But, they may very well still be talking about it behind the scenes. But this actually raises a more important question for me. I get that they were trying to save some things for subsequent parts, and that seems like a clever thing to do. You don't want to pull all your cards out of the bag. We didn't get to see Knights of the Round in Part 1. I'm very happy about that, as much as I would love to see that summon in the remake and how it's going to look and how it's going to function. They've got to save some of the big boys for the subsequent installments, haven't they? But it does raise an important question. For those of you that have completed the game, and I'm going to keep this as spoiler-free as possible, it kind of ends in a big way, doesn't it? Let's be honest. It really, really does. It kind of ends more than, oh, here's Firegar. In terms of the story and the characters, it pretty much is as climactic, at least, as the ending to the original game. Now, how do you go from that to then moving over to the Chocobo Ranch and throwing glacial greens all over the place? This concept of we let you have Fire, and Firegar, but not Flare, is all very well and good, but in terms of the story and the characters, they've taken us, it seems, right to the maximum magic, whatever that would be for story and characters. How are they going to move on from there without bringing the whole thing back down again for Part 2? I don't know if that's possible. We'll see where they go with that. And then finally, Endo finishes. Now, this is really interesting. He's speaking about the monster design, but make no mistake, the monster design and the story are very, very closely tied together. Just think about some of the monsters that you fought and some of the enemy encounters you had towards the final part of the game. Now, Endo mentions the fact that they were grappling with which enemies to bring over into the remake, even though you may not have fought them in the original game. And they're at that point anyway, and their number one priority was just to make a fantastic first installment. Now, this does raise questions as to how they are going to approach things for Part 2. I'm not going to give spoilers here, but some of the encounters that we had towards the end of Part 1, and to bring those out of the bag so early, does make one wonder, how are they going to keep that momentum moving in Part 2, when in the original story, we're moving on to Calm, we're throwing Chocobo Greens over the place. It just seems kind of anticlimactic as to where things have gone now. But hopefully they've got a roadmap. I'm sure they have. I'm sure they've got a roadmap and they know what they're doing. At least I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt here. But please do share your thoughts down in the comments below. And yeah, I do think this contrast, especially between the developers of the remake, those who are coming just as fans from the original and those who worked on the original, seem to approach things with whether they could change the story or keep it rigid, just very differently. And as I say, I'm sure both groups of people thoroughly care about Final Fantasy VII, just as we all do very deeply. And yet, that contrast between different approaches to how they could make the remake is very apparent here. And it's very honest that they talk about that in this interview. But yeah, please do share your thoughts down in the comments. Where do you think Part 2 is going to go? I'll be really interested in hearing those opinions. Not necessarily the story points, but in terms of just the overall design of the story. Do you think things are going to die down substantially from where Part 1 left off? Or do you think they're going to try and keep that momentum moving right from the get-go there? Again, I'm trying to be as spoiler-free as possible, but hopefully you guys that have completed the game, understand what I'm saying and what have you. But anyway, guys, thanks so much for stopping by, checking out the video. If there's any more translation coming out for the Ultimania interviews, I'll make sure to cover it here. Don't forget, I'm live streaming Final Fantasy VII quite regularly at the moment, so make sure you check out the Twitch channel if you haven't already. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.